Welcome everyone to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. We're back. We're back with Dr. Kaja Franck. Kaja, I'm so glad to have you back. Your werewolf episode is what probably one of the most beloved, for sure, especially by your family who makes lovely comments on the bottom of the videos, which is so nice. I love that they watch and that they're interested in vampires, werewolves, and all things monsters. But for those who don't know you and who didn't see that episode, can you please introduce yourself and tell us about the seminar that you're doing?
Oh, well, hello, I'm Dr. Kaja Franck, and I am a senior lecturer in literature at the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm also the program leader for the MA in Literature and Culture Online. So that's the professional side of my job. But in terms of research, I'm a specialist in Gothic monsters, and particularly I'm interested in nature and how we conceive nature as Gothic. So werewolves and vampires are very much my bread and butter. But I always say I do have a sideline in trolls and also shark horror randomly, which isn't really gothic, it's horror, but I absolutely love it. So that's kind of what I do day to day. Last year I had my first monograph out, which is the Eco Gothic Werewolf in Literature. Wolves, Woods, and Wilderness. I also had an article about shark horror, and I've got a couple of articles coming out either later this year or next year. One is about monsters, building on the monster theory book, but it's a less academic sort of text. It's really interesting. It's kind of reflecting on how monstrosity is important to me in terms of how I conceive of myself and identity and research. And then a couple more chapters about indigenous werewolves in North American literature, and also about women and werewolves, which I'm co-authoring with Hannah Priest. But recently, I got a chance to go back to the thing that kind of started it all, and that is vampires. So I've loved vampires, I think, since I knew what the word was. I've loved them since I stayed up at 10 to when I was 10, and I stayed up very late to watch the Neil Jordan interview with the vampire
The
with my
best
best
one.
friend who fell asleep. And then I started off. Yeah, she fell asleep and I stayed awake. And I get it. I look back, I look at where we're at in our lives now, and I'm like, we are different people. One of us was and going to go on and get a sensible job. And one of us was watching it going, I think there's a subtext. And that was me. So yeah, so I was asked to do a talk about vampires, and I chose to do it about women and vampires, particularly vampire literature, but sort of spreading out the tendrils to where women and vampires lead you to. And it was an absolute delight. I did it last week, and my parents and various family members also attended online, and bless them, have said that they've sat and watched like the recording again. And I was like, that's very cute, guys. And yeah, the best comment from my dad, which was, I don't really know how you hold that in your tiny little head. And that was the
Thanks,
comment.
Dad. I think last time your dad's comment was how come I can only see your teeth, which is such a dad comment, such a parent comment. I love it so much. Brilliant.
Yeah,
I love,
but
but
yes,
it's nice that they're supportive and that they support our both collective obsession with monsters for sure. And so you said that you loved them ever since you knew what the word was, but what does the word vampire actually mean?
well, that is an excellent question. And one which I'm going to be honest is somewhat beyond my remit of expertise, since I tend not to go into etymology. Generally, though, as far as I can see, it's a big debate.
Hmm.
There's some discussion about where it came from. Not as much of a debate as I think about Nosferatu, which seems to be the word that everyone loses their mind over. But in terms of sort of like the history of it, it's a word that has a lot of weight, but my area is more kind of like, I'm always obsessed with what does it mean right now,
Hmm.
which I know is I know this is going to probably annoy your listeners because I'm always the one who's like, well, I mean, that's cool, but I kind of just think about Buffy a lot. Um, that's mainly what I think about when I think about vampires. Recently, someone said something on an email about being concerned about stakeholders, and I was like, the only stakeholders I care about are Buffy. Um,
Me too.
but yeah, can I throw this back to you? Would you like to maybe give a little bit more about the word vampire? Because I know it's your expertise, and then I can come and like tendril in with my interests
Well, to be
when we
honest with you,
get
you're
into
not
my
wrong.
space.
We don't really know. There's a great debate over it. It was first used in the mid 1700s by a French person talking about a Hungarian thing that was happening. And that so we got it from the French vampire with the Y. But we don't know. It was somebody who's writing to Monsieur l'Envers, and he was saying something about certain dead bodies, and then he said they are called in Hungary vampires with YRES, and they're saying that they'd killed several people, and that's all we know. And so there's a lot of question about, is this from the Hungarian? Is this from Old Slavonic? Or is this from Serbian? Is this from Bulgarian? Again, we don't know. There's two schools of thoughts about this, and some Slavic linguists say that it came from Uver, meaning witch. I don't think that's likely, but it might be. Who knows? But that is where we get the word from in English, at least. And what it originally meant, again, it was talking about certain dead bodies. So what does that mean? Is it like a revenant? Is it like a zombie? Is it a mummy? I don't have that answer.
This is the thing I always find very interesting because this is when you talk to people about what their understanding of vampire is nowadays, most people, particularly in Anglophone, westernized countries, they have a very specific idea of what it is. And people get really frustrated when you can't give them definitive answers. And I'm so interested, like people are like, well, tell me, when was the first vampire? And I'm like, I mean, well, I don't think they exist. So
Of course, we
there
we did
wasn't
this with
one.
werewolves. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. No,
Yeah,
no.
sorry, they do. Vampires 100%. But I find this intriguing. I also think it's one of the problems, and it highlights something that's really important, which is the issue around translation. And
Hmm.
again, this comes up a lot. And one of the points that I always make is I try and talk about vampire-like entities as opposed, and you've heard me talk about this about werewolves, as opposed to going around the world and being like, that's a vampire, that's a vampire, that's a vampire, because there is a lot of contention in this area. So, in my talk, I wanted to talk about maternal anxieties because I think there's a lot about motherhood and vampires coming through. And it is interesting. Like, I am intrigued when I see parallels in terms of entities that are undead or blood drinking in other cultures, particularly when they seem to be around maternal issues. And there's a few in Southeast Asia. And again, I'm going to have to put my hands up and say I'm not an expert here in that particular folklore. I think I probably have to go and live and understand it. But you had the Manangal in the Philippines and the Pontianak in Malaysia, and both of which are around the idea of, so the Pontiac is around, and again, to be clear, there's lots of versions, as there always is, but the Pontiac is around the idea of a woman who dies whilst pregnant. She's often wronged and or killed by a man, typically the father, and she comes back as an undead spirit who is then vengeful, either against the man, but also can sometimes prey on other pregnant women and children and babies. The Manangal from the Philippines is far more bizarre in that it is a viscera sucker that splits in half. So splits at the waist, leaves the bottom half on the ground and flies off.
Oh,
And more broadly fits within the Philippines' understanding of witches and witchcraft. And so it's kind of under that banner. And then goes and particularly, it kind of has almost a proboscis, like a long tongue, and goes and specifically goes for babies and children. Now, in both cases, the thing that intrigued me there is how much it tells us about anxiety around maternity, pregnancy, legitimacy of the child, um, and also death of children, which, even in developed nations, let alone 400 years ago, it doesn't really matter. There's still small babies are they're tiny and they're very vulnerable and they get sick and they do die, and it is a tragedy and often the greatest fear of the parents of that child. So I was intrigued by the fact that these creatures seem to be exploring what is a common fear. The other thing I think is interesting is that they're kind of, certainly the Pontianak is an undead creature. The Menangal, it's not as clear that they're undead. They just seem to have these supernatural capabilities. But the idea that birth is a transitional point like death, and the two are so closely related that you may need supernatural entities as a space to express anxieties. Um, but I'm also really conscious that there's a scholar that I was reading called Andrew Hoxun Ng, and he essentially was doing an overview, particularly of the Pontianak, but he was saying they're not vampires.
Mm,
Please don't do that thing where you call them vampires, because his argument is like there are no vampires in the East. They, in popular culture and media, as westernization increases and colonization, become more like a Western concept of the vampire, almost to conform to get attention, but also because these ideas sort of lead together. But I was really interested by his argument and I found it incredibly convincing. So I always say, like, I'm not trying to say that these are vampires. I'm saying it's interesting that we respond similarly across the world to fears around maternal anxiety, albeit those fears are somewhat different, because how maternal, like, anxiety around maternity is depicted in Dracula with Lucy Westenra is
mhm.
very different, because it's a different time, a different place, and there's different social and cultural concerns.
But that goes right back to antiquity. I mean, even if you say something like Lilith, right? What is she? What is she doing, right? She say or even Lamashtu in ancient Mesopotamia, she sucks the life from newborns. That's what she does. So, but she's not a vampire, is she, or is she? Or is she? Or I don't know. There's also the Jiangxi in China. There's West African vampire-like creatures. There's the Rokurokubi in Japan. These are all females that will prey at night, or they prey on, as you say, they prey on children, or they prey on women. Some of them are vengeful beings, some of them are not. But can we really call them vampires? I don't have the answer to this question, and I don't know.
I mean, technically, if there isn't actually a definitive etymology of the word vampire, well, you can just make up as you go along. And I think I said this last time, and I stand by it. Either you have to have the word vampire being so loose that it is not an act of translation, or an absorption of another folk belief or identity or supernatural entity into a Western concept. It's just so baggy, anything's a vampire. Or the alternative is you have to be a little bit more precise in your language and say things like vampire like, and be interested in these shared threads. My sons have a book that they were listening to, and the it's about like the history of medicine,
Hmm.
and kind of what the author's drawing attention to is that, like, medical phenomenon were recognized across a vast majority of places. So sometimes, even though we might think of it from a Western perspective, actually those discoveries, you can't say there was a one discovery of it. And he uses the example of football, and he's like, well, technically we would say football started in Europe and it's become a very, British sport, albeit not the only one, because obviously it's massive in Europe. But actually, there were loads of games where people were kicking a ball or a ball like and sub like thing into a goal like thing. Like, the idea that you can kick balls seems to be quite a universal. We worked out things roll. You can kick it. You've got long legs. That hip joint is made for this sort of movement. And I think that's the thing I always sort of think about in the back of my mind. So yes, it's useful to have an organizing narrative about where football came from, and we can see that that word and where did it come from. But the actual concept of kicking ball with foot is far broader. Um, and I, yeah, I mean, it seems so obvious to me that.
The sense of the sense of like the universal vampire, that idea of like a person who preys on others, and not necessarily through like biting them but a person who preys on others, that is attested as early as 1741. So you can say anybody is an emotional vampire, that kind of thing. So it's quite an early thing. I think really we get into this whole idea of like Western vampires, because we had obviously werewolf trials in late 1500s, witch trials 1600s, and then really we get to the whole vampire craze in the 1700s. Obviously, Lady Bathory aside, because we can talk about her. Did she really do those things? Did she really torture and kill 600 young girls? Did she really do it?
I find this really interesting. So Elizabeth Bathory is one of those figures I heard about when I was reading my many books about serial killers. I'm inclined to think she probably wasn't the nicest of people in a somewhat there's no smoke without fire, but also because culturally at the time and in that area with that kind of class hierarchy. I mean, I live in the UK. I know what class hierarchies do. I know how people at the top can get away with or attempt to get away with quite terrible things, including in the 21st century, mentioning no names. Um, but I think we all know who I'm talking about. Prince Andrew. So
He's
I don't think
certainly
I
a
can make
vampire, I would say.
Prince Andrew make a brilliant vampire. Also, apparently, he doesn't sweat, according to the interview that he did. He claimed that's why one of his accusers had misidentified him because she described him as sweaty. And he actually, unfortunately, has a medical condition where he can't sweat,
So
which,
so
as I
he's so
stand,
he's a so he's confirmed vampire. Is that what we're saying? Is that he's a confirmed? Okay.
I mean, I
Understandable.
guess from a Marxist perspective, of course, yes. The moment we start getting like Marx coming in and that representation of vampires and class and capital, absolutely. So yeah, looking at that, I can well believe that Elizabeth Bathory committed some very unpleasant crimes. More practically, given the benefits that go to her accusers, I can also really see maybe she committed some crimes that another member of the nobility would have been allowed to get away with. But at that point, it would have been convenient to make them seem larger, just so that you could put her away. You could Matthias can claim the land that she owns and various other things. I would also say there seems to be no evidence that they can find the bodies, and
Nope.
that's a lot of bodies. And with the best will in the world, she didn't live on a pig farm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She lived in the castle. I mean, not only that, but we talk about, how many people maybe she did not nice things to, but the accusations of her being a vampire and like living in baths of blood, that came many years after she died. She was never tried, she was never convicted, probably because she was a noble. Some of the people that worked for her were put on trial instead. But she lived very comfortably in her castle until she died at 54. And so it was, as you say, it was King Matthias who started accusing her of things very late in her career. I think 1610, 1611 was the first accusation around. And they didn't try her until much later. And like as you say, they never found bodies. Um, they never found anything. I know there was one academic who is claiming that she might have saved about 60 women from murder, but I don't know. But we don't know if that's true yet. I would love to see if that would be so. I think that's pretty interesting. But as you say, it's really her creditor. It's really the people who borrowed money from her and people who wanted the land from her that started making all these accusations much long after she was already no longer in power and long after she was dead.
And again, it's that thing where it's that the narrative will keep building, it will exaggerate. And it's interesting that it happens well after she's dead, but also around the time where interest in vampires starts going up.
Hmm.
So suddenly you've got a lens through which to see certain violent crimes. And this is a time before we would understand the term serial killer or those ideas. So that becomes that lens of monstrosity is the lens by which you look at people. As I said, I think there's that it's kind of a catch 22 in either way. The fact that she was powerful made her more at risk, but it also means that potentially, as you said, she wasn't tried. So she was protected from some of the worst accusations. So either way, you can argue it both ways. Like, well, actually, they didn't try her properly, so maybe she did do it. But also, you can say, but that power would have made her vulnerable as a woman. And she was a widow by that point. And you can also argue that sort of, well, the fact that they didn't find any bodies shows that there's no evidence for it, but also at the time they wouldn't have had sniffer dogs. How well were they searching? And it's a really historical case, so it's very hard to prove. Maybe at some point there'll be an excavation and it will be like at the Magdalen laundries and they'll find a septic tank full of bodies. I think it'll be unlikely that that's the case. I suspect it's just going to remain kind of a mystery. As well as that, like 650 people is
That's a
a
lot.
lot.
Yeah.
And to hide it for that long is going to be hard. And to have that many hours in a day,
Yeah,
it's,
exactly.
I know she's rich, okay? I know she's got more time, but I'm not sure personally whether that's likely. I do think it's very interesting though in terms of how in the 1700s that narrative becomes less about a violent, aggressive, aberrant woman who's behaving in a way that is intolerable because it's violent and it's not acceptable for her gender and she's, and it's associated with her power. So in the 1700s, it becomes about vanity and
Hmm.
it starts becoming about looks and vanity. And I think that's such an interesting transition. And in some ways, I think that kind of predicts the arrival of the vampire as more of a fictional literary entity that can then just hold the weight of all this symbolism. And it is something that I think, again, we see as this double bind for women, where you need to stay youthful and beautiful, but you also can't do it in a way that people see as monstrous. So a woman's obsession with her beauty and youth is monstrous, but she also needs to be beautiful and youthful. And there's no real escape there. That's kind of what I think it's quite interesting to see how that interpretation comes in the 1700s.
Also in the 1700s came the first, I guess you'd say, vampire panics in like the 1725 to 1734 with the whole Habsburg monarchy in Eastern Prussia, where you start getting all of these of finger pointing, you're a vampire, and then suddenly all these dead people start coming back alive and killing their sons and th that kind of thing. And it's interesting that how all of these vampire attacks that happened in Eastern Prussia feed into that narrative of yes, though those were specifically against men, but again, it's this whole like succession thing with children, it's parents coming back to prey upon their children then being killed by their parents, and then anybody who helps them, oh, they magically vanish and their neighbors are swept away and eaten or anything like that. But the original vampire attacks, quote unquote, in the 1700s, they said that the sons were killed and from a loss of blood. Doesn't say that they were bitten, doesn't say, that anything, just a loss of blood. Could have just been regular old murder. Why it has to be a vampire, I don't know. But that's what it was blamed on.
I and again, I'm intrigued. But I love everything to do like how people perceive
Hmm.
the human body, and it's back to that thing of course there's anxiety about death because death is a mystery and people find it uncomfortable, and the way that we process it is through various rituals, and those rituals may ostensibly be about processing grief, but then they become about processing actual death and the corpse itself. So when they aren't being followed properly, then you get anxiety, and maybe it's just an expression of the deferment of grief or the fact that grief hasn't been able to be handled effectively. But again, back to that thing, then blood, that recognition of loss of blood is not a good thing. If you lose enough of it, you're going to die. I'm assuming most cultures worked out early doors. Like this red stuff really should stay in the body and not keep escaping. And yeah, I like that idea that. And then there are diseases we know make you look like you're losing blood, even if you're not actually losing blood. Things like all kinds of pernicious forms of anemia, tuberculosis. And whilst I don't like the idea of medical explanations for outbreaks of vampirism necessarily, I think there's a few exceptions, including the New England vampire out like or panic. But that seems quite a specific one. I do think that the existence of those diseases likely helped people understand that losing blood is scary, and perhaps even thinking like those diseases look like loss of blood, even if they weren't necessarily. But what you say about succession as well is so interesting because those early vampires, they're not sexy.
Yeah,
They're
they're
not
just people
what
who
we,
died and then came back to haunt their kids. That's pretty much it.
yeah. And I guess in a way, I'm a bit like, oh, I can see how that might be a narrative if you inherit, if you have, if you inherit, if you're concerned about inheritance. There was a channel, I think it was on Channel 4. There was a show a few years ago in the UK on Channel 4, I think, which was essentially about the idea of the elderly becoming zombies. And it was a very Yes, it was very obvious. It was obvious enough that I was like, I'm not sure I need to watch this. But essentially, it was the idea of like the elderly becoming a drain on youth and society, and a response to the fact that the UK is, an aging society. We're not having babies at a high enough rate to replace our population, and we our pension bill is absolutely huge. And fair enough, we should be paying pensions, but I think there is a lot of anxiety of how can we maintain this because it's like a bubble at the top, particularly as younger people are watching their pension move further and further into the future. So this again, there's still this undeath, this death is natural, but it can also be unnatural issues around succession. It's amazing that people are like worrying about this in 1700s and then we get to the 21st century and we're still having these concerns because realistically many of our legal systems haven't changed hugely
Yeah,
when it
not
comes
much,
to
no. Especially as when you look at some of the first vampire stories, like The Vampire in 1748 by Austin Felder. And then also we have things like Lenore and even Percy Bysshe in his Spectral Horseman. None of these vampires are sexy or scary. They're just normal things or normal people who just happen to suck the life away from something. And all these people are rich. Like again, it's like this whole idea of rich succession, somebody sucking this away, and of how these things are the same idea over and over and over again. In your talk, you talked about specifically Christabel, which is a long narrative by Coleridge. So we talk about how this is possibly a very important pivotal moment for vampire stories.
well, yeah, mainly because I would argue that Christabel is really very overtly sapphic. I It's always hard because we tend to think, oh, it was accidental and people didn't notice at a time. And I can never be sure to what degree. Is that what we like to tell ourselves about the past, that people just didn't notice sex and sexuality? Um, that's the story I think we like to tell ourselves about people in the past, but people in the past were having sex in a variety of different ways, whether it was acknowledged, whether there was language to communicate that in the same way that we do now is a different discussion. But Christabel, for those of you who haven't, if anyone hasn't read it, it was written sort of in two parts. 1797 is the first part, and then you get the second part in 1800s. And essentially, it's about a young woman, Christabel, and she's living with her father, and she goes out to the woods one night and she comes across Geraldine, who's a mysterious woman, who's not under anyone's protection, which is always very anxiety inducing in the late 1700s if you're a young woman of a certain background and you're under no protection. So Christabel's like, come back to my father's house. And the key scene perhaps that people talk about is the scene in which Geraldine is undressing and Christabel looks as Geraldine undresses and sees something on her bosom. And that isn't clarified at any point. Um, Talking of Shelley, you mentioned Shelley.
Mm.
Um, this is the poem that Byron is reading out at the Via Diodati, which leads to Shelley screaming and having a bit of Percy. Shelley, not Mary Shelley, though she writes about it in her diary, having a bit of a meltdown because in his head he suddenly saw a woman who had eyes for nipples. And I think that's just wonderful, sort of like all of it coming together, how
That's
literature
definitely a
influences
kink
further
he's
literature,
kept in for a very
further
long
literature.
time. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's definitely a
it
kink.
really is. So I feel like Christabel's really important from that level, that it kind of sets up this idea that vampirism for women is a sidestepping of the normative like rules for women,
Hmm.
because there's always an association. You see this not just in Coleridge, but then in 1872 with Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which has a very similar storyline. Carmilla is found by Laura, and Carmilla's taken into Laura's house. And in both cases, the patriarchs have to come in to reassert power to get rid of this evil vampiric woman. But it's noticeable that in both cases, the vampiric women appear, although they are vulnerable, they do still seem to have money, and they still seem to have means, which means they are independent. And they are also absolutely sidestepping the paternal order. They're coming in, they're after your daughters, they're seducing your daughters away from good things. And they are also, if they are vampiric, living forever, and they're not having children. To come back to that motherhood, they're not
Mm.
getting married to a man, they're not passing from the father to the husband and having children. They are completely sidestepping that sense of how time functions as a woman and how power functions as a woman. And I think for that, that speaks a lot to anxieties that were rising in the late 1700s and then really peaking into the 1800s as we have the rise of the new woman and then moving into suffrage as well.
Same thing with Ligeia by Edgar Allan Poe. Same thing, where he, again, it's about a very beautiful but wealthy woman who dies. And then a man marries a lady, and then oh, suddenly she comes back, and the very rich ladies are in having this camaraderie with each other. Now, I mean, we don't know, the narrator of the story is unreliable in that respect, but it's again, it's that same idea of these two wealthier women, maybe not super rich, but wealthier women not having kids or dying virgins in the case of Ligeia, and then coming back and having a grand old time in the undeath afterlife. Somebody else.
There's, I mean, Poe is just a box full of neuroses. I mean, he reminds me a bit of H.P. Lovecraft, where it's like, yes, hella problematic. Do not like want to hang out with these guys. Think they've got a lot of issues, but I think that was kind of what makes their writing so good, because their writing is so obviously infused with whatever is going on inside their mind. And Poe is really obsessed with a specific type of woman. He actually seems to prefer a brunette, but they're often, well, they look very consumptive. So they look like they have consumption, or what we would call tuberculosis. They're very thin, very pale. And this comes up time and time again. You know, you see it with Madeline in The Fall of the House of Usher, amongst others. And there's kind of a real desire there. I won't go as far to say as fully necrophilic, but it's definitely got overtones. But what I find interesting about Poe is you would assume that a thin, pale woman who's wasting away is weak, but he also seems to like power as well. So right at the end of Leisure, you the description of Leisure coming back through this second wife is full of power, and he sort of talks about glorious effulgence and eyes burning. And I find that very interesting, that he has that, the desire for the power, but also through quite a frail looking body. And as I said, Poe, this just seems to be a thing that's very peculiar with Poe. But it is, to me, it's intriguing in terms of how he perceives female power. The fact that it's always narrated, though, is interesting, because if we're using a bit of literary theory, it's a male narrator who's unnamed. Now, one could argue that that means that it kind of draws attention to the focalization on like to actually like looking at the woman and the woman being center stage. But at the same time, the fact that it's being narrated by a man, there is an element of objectification there. So they might be seemingly powerful in some ways, but they are always kind of controlled by the often unreliable narrator. And so their afterlife and their existence is still through how he tells it.
Mm.
So yeah, it's a clever little internal aspect of Poe's writing there.
Sort of the same thing with Dracula, right? Because I mean, we don't hear about Lucy in her own words, right? We're always hearing it from a third person. And so we don't really know necessarily how she feels. I mean, again, Lucy is pretty she gets off pretty well because she has several suitors who all want to marry her, and then she dies, and then she comes back, but then she becomes this, in her undeath, becomes this great creature. She sort of merits the Grand Nagus in the middle of it. I'd say it's sort of, I guess, well, Carmilla's a little bit different because Carmilla, even though it came out 25 years before Dracula, Carmilla has, I think, more power. And there, I think, because it's very much about the relationship that she has with her young woman, but Laura is the narrator in Carmilla. And so Laura is she a reliable now? I mean, we have to believe her, but Laura is in Carmilla is telling us what happened in her relationship with the vampire, whereas in Dracula, it's again it's a more of a male narrator telling us about what happened with Mina and Lucy. And so how do we see the vampiric relationship change in those things?
Well, I mean, Carmilla, the afterlife of Carmilla is exceptional. Carmilla is adapted and adapted and adapted. And whilst many of those earlier adaptations, particularly when we think of the Hammer horror sort of lesbian vampire series, which is based around the Karnstein trilogy, is very much from a male perspective. We have Ingrid Pitt and a lot of heaving bosom, and it's meant to be for titillation. Once you get further down the line, and even in the last 5 years, there are still adaptations of Carmilla coming out, rewritings, retellings of Carmilla. So Carmilla then gets picked up and becomes quite an iconic figure in terms of writing about lesbianism. And there is then a long tradition of sort of lesbian vampires, even up to things like the Gilda stories by
Hmm.
Jewel Gomez, which comes out in the 1990s. Having said, and I think personally that's because having Laura as the narrator, having that possibility that Laura is enjoying it, and it is very much there that Laura might be enjoying what's happening. And it's not clear whether her fear and disgust is because she herself is fearful and full of disgust, or whether that's because she lives in a society where that's kind of been taught to her. And even after Carmilla dies, she still sort of talks about this dreamy quality. So I think inbuilt within Le Fanu's narrative is this reflective possibility that that actually Carmilla is a bit of a hero and that we want to hear more about. You don't get that to the same degree, I would argue, in Dracula. You kind of have to work harder. And I'm very much justice for Lucy Westenra. And I think she's a great character. But as you said, Mina, we get to see her transcribing things, organizing, being a good little secretary. But Lucy, it's all from the perspective of what other people are saying around her. And I suspect that's more to do with by the fact that we're getting to the late 1800s, we're close to the fin de siècle, and we are reaching a real crisis point. We've got Queen Victoria likely to die soon. So this strong female monarch who's been keeping the country together. We're seeing, we're starting to see the British Empire dissolving. Whether I don't think Stoker's necessarily consciously writing about that, but of course, in the backdrop, it's going to be this cultural anxiety. We have worries about masculinity because masculinity is in crisis, which when isn't it in crisis, if I'm honest with you? I feel like every 50 years there's another article about masculinity being in crisis and somehow it's women's fault. In this case, masculinity is in crisis because over in North America, there's all these strong men who are out in the wilderness and they're controlling the land. And then the European men have become effete and a bit too feminized. And similarly, we then have the rise of the new woman, which is actually actively mentioned in the novel Dracula, where
Hmm.
Lucy Westenra sort of says, we and Mina sort of say we'd have eaten so much we'd have scared a new woman, and we're already getting mentions of like abnormal appetite from women. So I think what really happens is we just get a far more anxious text, and a text that is a lot more like small c conservative in its presentation. And that is just so focused on Lucy and what happens to her. And this really vibrant character has three men who are in love with her, and she would like to marry all of them, but she has to make a choice. And again, another hint, oh, she eats a lot and she wants three men. Like, we're already getting hints that there's something already kind of vampiric and wrong about her. She doesn't have her father around. So she doesn't, unlike Carmilla and Christabel, have a patriarch in her life. She's got quite a feckless mother coming in. And that's a real trope that we sort of get in Gothic narratives. The Gothic heroine is in some ways betrayed by the mother, either through her absence or through her presence in this case. So when Lucy becomes a vampire, it's kind of like, well, there was an inevitability. What then happens to her, though, is very upsetting. Firstly, we see her preying on children. And going back to what I previously said about female vampires bypassing that normative behavior, it's completely inverted. She goes, she's at an age where she should be getting married and having children, and instead she's the undead and she's killing children, or at least feeding off children. Actually, it's not clear that she kills any of the children. It's more that she just feeds off them. And again, earlier we've seen the three vampiresses in Dracula being fed a baby. So this is what evil vampiresses do. And the upshot of that is the group staking scene, which I think has been convincingly read as a sort of like a group rape or group sexual assault. I mean, you don't have to think really hard to see a stake as a phallic symbol. The fact that Van Helsing kind of orchestrates it, the description of her sort of like writhing and screaming, and the blood coming out when like she's penetrated by the stake. All of this, I think, is it's pretty unpleasant when you reread it even now. And then you have her being beheaded, and the sort of ideas about the virgin head and the removal of that. And then her corpse, somehow we're back at necrophilia, is a well-ordered corpse. And Arthur Holmwood, her fiance, gets to kiss her lips now that she's one of God's true dead. It's, yeah, like I think people are like, oh, it's not as gross, it can't be that gross. And you're like, no, read it. It's really uncomfortable. And
That
it's
the text is
really,
pretty
again,
clear. It's pretty clear. Yeah, that
yeah,
he kisses her beheaded head. Yeah.
yeah, and I think you don't have to. I don't think you have to have a degree in literature to be able to go, I think there's subtext going on. I think there's a message going on about women there and what they should and should not be doing. I think I'm one of those people. I really don't like Van Helsing. I mean, I like him when he's played by oh, Wolverine. I know he has another name, but I like him when
Oh
he's
no, that
played
movie
like
was
that
great.
version.
That movie was amazing, schlock. Probably the
Yeah.
best werewolf in any. And the vampire
Yes.
queens in that movie are so glamorous. My Monica Bellucci was unbelievable. But it's a stupid film. But I think the representations of monsters, of vampires and werewolves in that film is excellent still to this day.
It's so much fun. So that Van Helsing, great. Van Helsing in the novel, I don't want him anywhere near me. He kind of scares me. And the more I read it, when I reread it, I'm like, oh my God, he's such a grifter. He's
Oh
such
yeah,
a grifty brute.
he's really played up as sort of like a witchfinder general. And that again with that ultra conservative, ultra like we must smash the new women now kind of thing. And how he really doesn't see it's not like the anime version of Van Helsing where he's super cool and has really cool guns and there's again a little bit of a sexual subtext there. In the book, he's very much a conservative sort of I kill monsters because I think all monsters are evil sort of way.
Yeah, and I can imagine him now because he's got that. Well, again, I'm looking at this very 21st century viewpoint, but he kind of aligns medicine and cutting edge medicine with his sort of folkloric supernatural understanding. And I could so see him on Joe Rogan. That's Can you see where I'm coming from? Like he'd be like, "Oh yeah, but alternative and la la la," but then he'd be talking about ivermectin because he read one like study somewhere, and the more I read him, the more I'm like, I don't think I really liked him first time round. He's slightly patronizing, and they all sort of fawn over him. I realize this is absolutely not what I'm meant to be saying. A while back, I did like when I was heavily pregnant, a series of videos about Dracula, and I don't know if I mentioned before, but I find it so funny. Like, and I talked about Lucy Westenra and how you can view Lucy Westenra, and that actually, like, I think you can really view her as quite a revolutionary character who's
Absolutely.
rejecting
Yeah.
these norms of gender and identity. And someone wrote underneath, because it was like, I feel sorry for her future children about me. And I was like, I'm not going to eat my children. Like that's
No, but
crazy. Like,
it is true. If you look at just the history of vampires and how women, it really has been women since the beginning. Where we've werewolves obviously go back and forth from a male to a female space again, where in terms of monsters and gender, and how in some cases, werewolves are like ginger snaps, right? Very much are supposed to represent a specific thing at a specific time in a woman's life. That's what ginger snaps is all about. But when it comes to vampires, even though we have big male characters like Dracula and the Alucard by extension, vampiric women are so powerful and they're seen as like these great independent figures. And even though they do, so even something like the new Castlevania series, we have these incredibly strong vampire women who run the show. And they have their own societies. They're wonderful. Sometimes they're anti-heroes, sometimes they're extreme villains, as in the recent season. But they don't, as you say, they don't have children. They make their own families or their own coteries, if you want to use the Vampire Masquerade uh discussion. And or even in something like Interview with the Vampire, where even though that is a very male-centric story, again with a very specific subtext, there's still Claudia. Claudia is turned when she's a child. And so her biggest thing is, I will never grow up because now I'm stuck as a tiny girl. And so I want a mother, right? There again is that whole maternal aspect of the vampires, right? So there is always this theme that keeps running with women vampires. They're strong, they're powerful. People have to take them down because, oh no, they can't get too much power. Because if they do, they'll turn all the other women. Well, why would you be afraid of that? Well, if you like a big strong dommy mommy, of course you would want a vampire lady. I think as well. What's it called? In Resident Evil recently, we have Lady Dimitrescu, whom everybody loves, the giant booby lady. Where you're just like, I don't want to run away from this 9 foot vampire lady and her very sexy daughters. I'll just let them kill me over and over again. Yay!
and, and the other thing I'm so amazed, I think it's so strong because the other thing is often there's just money. And whilst from a male vampire perspective, we can see sort of ideas about capitalism, and certainly I think there's, the fact that contemporary vampires are just rich, I think can be read as both a promotion of a capitalist society, the notion that you need money. But the flip side is that in economically uncertain times, the idea that you would turn into a vampire and then there's just money,
Hmm.
there's something quite soothing. And interestingly, how much that money comes through playing a capitalist system for the long game, the literally eternal game. Because you have, I'm thinking, so in the Gilda stories by Jewel Gomez, in Octavia Butler's Fledgling, I mean, it comes up with Interview the Vampire, but I'm thinking like with the Gilda stories and with Octavia Butler's Fledgling, they're both female vampires who are central characters, and they have investments.
Hmm.
So Gilda is like, oh yeah, I'm making cash off money that I invested because I bought a house here in the 1800s. And now, 150 years later, it's worth a lot more. And I put investments here and I did this and I did that. And there's, I think, something quite soothing about the idea that there would be financial consistency at any point in your life. And that's another thing that these female vampires seem to offer sort of, yeah, there is, you are just rich now. Don't worry about it. You don't need to worry about anything. You don't need to worry about time. You don't need to worry that you need to find a husband by a certain time or have kids by a certain time, or you get a job, or it's fine. Everything is sorted. And I can really see the appeal, particularly in these contemporary vampires, that
Absolutely.
comes
Even
through.
or even if they're poor, right? Even vampires are poor. Go prey on somebody who's rich. You win. There's no there's that's when we talk about like the World of Darkness series that became very popular in the 80s and 90s, the vampire in general is all about that. So if you're not one of the venture or one of the business vampires, or if you're not people who actually have a means of making money, if you're one of the poorer coteries, well, you can just prey on somebody who's rich and boom, you have money. Or you can use your spooky powers of your mind melding powers to convince somebody to give you money. And I think that's interesting how, especially it's really since the 1800s, that has been a running theme of vampiric stories is, as you say, oh, no matter what, you'll have money, don't worry about it. And it's also, again, this whole like you have money, therefore, or it's all about money and health. Are you sick? Because in Claudia's case in Interview with the Vampire, she gets turned because she's dying. She has the plague, or we think so. And so she gets turned because she's about to die anyway, might as well save her life. They could save it with doctors, but instead they save her by turning her, right? And they give her a mother in her undeath. She gets eternity, and then she gets an eternal mother. And again, in those stories, it just seems to keep going, where it's always the woman is either poor or dying. Oh, she becomes a vampire. Everything's now fine. Seems like a good life to me.
It's an excellent cure-all, and it's, like one of the things that you've touched on is like a couple of interesting. Firstly, that element of almost this the psychic quality,
Hmm.
and so the other thing, like, is you're suddenly a lot stronger and faster. So as a woman, you now don't have the vulnerabilities that you have been told you have your entire life. You are now stronger than often the men around you, although there's often a sexual dimorphism even in vampire world, but you're still a lot stronger, and you're stronger than certainly human men. So you physically get the strength, but you also get another element to your strength, which is typically you're very persuasive and very charming. So everything becomes heightened, both your abilities. And of course, with female vampires, which comes up time and time again, it's a lot of it's to do with sexiness and sexuality. And where that's causing a panic in the 1800s, by the time we're moving up into the late 20th century and the 21st century, that being able to enjoy sex without any risks, which
Hmm.
is really important, to enjoy sex and to have that sexual power is increasingly read as something that is a good thing. It's a benefit. Although we do obviously kind of have to mention Bella Swan getting pregnant by a vampire when she's human, because that is very risky. I have discovered that whenever vampires or whenever female vampires can get pregnant, or female humans get pregnant by vampires, typically it's a very dangerous affair, and it's more dangerous than just giving birth and pregnancy itself. So the supernatural, so you're not allowed to become a mum because you're getting enough by flirting with the supernatural world. So that's kind of like removed from you.
Or even in the underworld where they have like the vampire werewolf mix. We're like, oh no, this is two species of not undead creatures because I don't well, I guess in underworld the vampires are dead, but the werewolves are not. So therefore they have this whole like the super child who ends up showing up. But as you say, there's even in your seminar you have a very big distinction between sickness vampires, vampires that cause sickness, psychic vampires, consumptive vampires, or we have the desirous vampire. And it seems like all of these things pertain specifically to women because when we think about male vampires, at least in the terms of Dracula, whom we've discussed may or may not actually be a werewolf, who is just a vampiric werewolf. It seems like he doesn't apply to any of these things.
No, and I wonder again how much that's to do with the sort of so I'm thinking about like some of the representations of the sick female vampire 1800s into the early 1900s. A lot of that is probably again a perceived vulnerability of the female body. You get like this excellent quotation that comes up about the idea. So this guy S. Weir Mitchell is talking about hysteria, and he says like a hysterical girl is kind of like a vampire because where there's one, you're going to get more, and she will, and a hysterical girl sort of sucks the blood of those people around her. Now, yeah, I think this is firstly what they count as hysteria. Probably includes a lot of people now, including myself on a bad day, on a good day. Let's be honest. But I think the other thing that comes through there is that metaphorical use of vampirism. And so sucking blood is obviously meant to represent sort of sucking energy, and then causing further hysteria. This is all very metaphoric. And yet there's that back and forth between the metaphor that we find in, whether it's a text by, S. W. Mitchell talking about hysterical women, or it's Karl Marx talking about vampirism and dead labor and so forth. But then we find it kind of like then going into those fictional representations. And we get two, I think, quite interesting psychic vampires. First is the Blood of the Vampire from 1897, which is by Florence Marryat, and it's kind of the vampire book from that year that everyone forgets about because Dracula's come out.
Hmm.
And in this, whilst this novel has a lot about miscegenation, anxiety about race, the vampire herself, she doesn't know she's a vampire. She's just accidentally like killing a baby, obviously, because that's what classic female vampires do. But she doesn't know this about herself, and unfortunately, she then goes on to actually commit suicide when she realizes that she can't even get married without killing the man around her. This is a text that I think is a lot about vulnerability of women, and again, it's a lot about we find out that she is the daughter of an enslaved woman, and then a very evil slave owner. He's a white British guy, and he does these terrible experiments. And so you find out that that's her parentage. I think that's interesting because I think it's not quite clear. We tend to read it through the lens of like it's the fact that she's got like dual heritage, dual ethnicity. That might be a sign of her vampirism, and that would make sense in the late 1800s about anxieties, about race and purity. But at the same time, the white father is very evil, and it's very clear that what he's doing is being judged. There's also a tone that maybe that's another aspect that actually perhaps this vampirism comes through him. Either way, all of the women, like lots of the women in her family, have it, and so she ends up killing people unconsciously. And when she realizes, oh no, really it is me, she chooses to commit suicide. If we compare that to something like Luella Miller, which is a great short story from like 1902, it's Mary Wilkins Freeman, and I think Luella Miller I like because whilst you could critique how it represents gender, I think it's such a good story because we've all kind of met someone like this. And Luella Miller is just someone who just goes around being like, oh, everyone look after me. You have to look after me. And she slowly kills all the people who look after her because they all waste away. And I think, regardless of gender, we probably met people a bit like that. And a lot of people have read that actually through a framework of it being a critique of upper class women and learned helplessness that comes with class, and that they are just literally feeding off the people around them because they're too effete to do any work. So yeah, I think these are really intriguing ways. Again, it's back to that notion of womanhood, though, back to centering the female body as the space of these anxieties. You're not getting male vampires functioning in the same way at this point. And actually, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, I don't even see any similar things coming even nowadays or over the next few hundred years.
No, no, it's interesting how they had that emotional vampire way back then because well, the emotional vampire I think many people think of now is from What We Do in Shadows. And it's very funny, but it is very true. We're just like, oh, this guy, God, just get him out of here. He's so boring.
I love when he gets that he might start stating in the TV show when he meets someone, and how interesting the woman he meets is a misery vampire, like kind of like Miller, a sort of like a victimhood and plays on that. And I think that's probably quite a gendered representation coming through, because I think like we wouldn't necessarily, even in modern day, be as sympathetic to men who've had horrible things happening, or who are sort of saying like I'm vulnerable, look after me. We might find that quite distasteful. Whereas for the female vampire, in What We Do in the Shadows, it's very well observed. It's just honestly, I think that's so funny, and I think it's so clever, and like we've all met people who are like that, both the male and female version, where you're like, oh my god, you are the worst, and I can't, like, please stop. Um,
There are,
yeah, I
it's
think it's a
interesting
really
that those are very funny vampires. In Witcher 3, in Blood and Wine, there is a whole story about three vampires who live in Beauclair. And so Geralt is actually the main character, is actually friends with one of them named Regis. And Regis is a good vampire, somebody who helps him out, who helps him solve crimes. But he has to go against Detlef, who is a vampire, a male vampire, who has fallen in love with someone who has tricked him and wronged him. He fell in love with a woman who has wronged him. And so now they have to decide whether or not is he a bad guy because he's a vampire, even though he's killing bad people, or is he actually a good guy who has taken out the trash? And so there, but there is another woman vampire who's with him, who's friends with him, who is running an orphanage, and she's feeding off the children but not killing them. But she's giving them an actual good life. She's teaching them and all. And so again, you have a choice to make. Do I kill this woman for taking in these orphans in order to feed off them? Or is she doing a service because these kids would have died either from war or from disease? And again, a choice that you have to make because there are really bad unconscious vampires that are like Bruxa and all that kind of thing, and you just kill them and they're not. But then there are these higher vampires that just sort of live in the world, and everybody kind of knows that they're there, but you just don't bother them, and it's fine. But they don't see them as bad entities. They see them as entities that ward off disease or ward off death. So they kind of just let them have their fun. And as long as you don't bother them, they don't kill anybody. As well, there are three witches in the series who are not vampires, but who are much more vampiric, who kill children and then hang their ears off their necks. Pretty cool. But it's really awesome. But these witches are more vampiric, as we would say, and yet they're very clearly bad, and but they're keeping a certain village protected. And again, you have that choice of going, well, what do we do here? Are we going to kill these vampiric witches because they're obviously eating children as a sacrifice or ritual? But are there children that nobody would have wanted anyway? So it's just, are we kind of saving their souls? Like there's a lot of questions about salvation, damnation, who deserves to be damned. And again, it seems to be the women in this series, the vampiric women, who are mostly associated with protection and children. Very, very interesting that even now, even in such modern representations, that's still there.
and it would make absolute sense because I think we're still battling with this idea of, well, what do women do? Are they defined by their motherhood? Are they not? And I still think we're also struggle with this idea of just having purely evil women in a way that we don't necessarily seem to have that same anxiety when it comes to some of the male vampires. And again, I am well aware that like we have Interview the Vampire, Louis, and we obviously have Angel and Spike. I and the Cullens. I am well aware that increasingly we see this, you know, a representation of vampires who are battling with the notion of a soul or morality or good and evil, etc., etc. But whereas that seems to have be a recent thing across the board, it does seem to be a thing like with women that, well, what kind of evil are they? And what kind of dangerous are they? And how much does their danger become a complete inversion of what we expect a woman to be? And I am intrigued as well that it comes back again to this idea of like children and childhood, because most vampires can't have children, and yet somehow, despite that, they still end up attached to children. There's a short story called A Good Lady Duquesne, from 1896, and your comment about taking in children and feeding off them, but are you kind of giving them a good life? Reminded me of that because in this, it's a very old lady, and they describe like, oh, she's grotesquely old, and she wants a lady's helper, and she chooses young women who otherwise would be financially very vulnerable, and she takes them off to Europe and doesn't really ask for much of them. They just have to read her a book. Now it's very clear that she's feeding off them to keep them alive, keep her alive, and there's like she has an evil doctor that helps. And although by the end, what happens is her latest victim gets free and gets a load of money from her, and what have you, and ends up going to marry a very nice young man. It's if you actually look at it closely, the women that she employs, the young women that she employs, they don't really have many prospects. They're
Hmm.
usually doing it because they have to give money back to their family. So yes, they do die, but they are able to send money back to their family. And how many young women died in service and were very vulnerable because they go into service? And so, in some ways, I think you can also read it as yes, the good Lady Duncan is evil, but it's really talking about a system that is evil, in which there is no protection for these vulnerable young women or vulnerable children. So, what are we going to do? And is this the cruelest option that we have available?
As well, I think it's interesting that when you talk about, because you mentioned Angel from Buffy, it seems the whole mythos of inviting a vampire in, that really only extends to male vampires, whereas female vampires already seem to be in the home. Very interesting. Whereas a male one, you always have to invite it in. And again, is that whole the idea of, oh, you're inviting evil in. It's somebody in the home. It's their fault if you invite the vampire in. But a female vampire is already in your home.
Of course, because it kind of only makes sense if you assume that it's a non-domestic entity, but women are always meant to be, well, not always, but certainly from the 1800s, when we really get this rise in vampire literature onwards, they're already domestic. So, of course, they're already in the home because they're already in the home. I do like that you mentioned Angel, though, because one of the things I find very interesting, if we're going to like jump to the next kind of inversions, we sort of talked a bit about sexy female vampires and how it can be used as a way for men to be looking at titillating monstrous entities, and in some ways, just as Poe pacified these seemingly wild, aberrant women through the narrative voice, so too you can have these wild, sexy women, but it's men looking at them, so they still remain objectified. You do start seeing more and more male vampires who are there to titillate the women, and the real rise of paranormal romance in the second half of the 20th century, and then coming, it just seems to get more and more extreme. I find that quite delightful. And it brings me back to watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And there's a scene where Angel is in leather trousers and he's handcuffed to the end of Drusilla's four-poster bed, and she's pouring like holy water down him and saying, "You've been a very bad daddy." And my mum was like, I walked in, saw that scene, thought, this is probably going to come back to haunt me, and just walks out. Because she's like, if I explain why it's so okay on the nose, then maybe I'm giving more ideas. But if I just go, well, I mean, she's like 13, 14, we'll just see
She
what
doesn't know
happens
what's
there.
going on. Yeah.
Yeah, she doesn't. And I found, yeah, and that amused me a lot. But also, again, that was so obviously for a female audience. The amount of times like Spike ends up, well, they really towards increasingly like to brutalize Spike, and make him, he gets really hurt a lot and topless. He's topless and vulnerable and hurt. And that's so intriguing to me because it does suggest this like reclamation of the gaze in some ways. And again, Edward Cullen, the amount that like male critics hated the films and the books, but particularly the films, because the films kind of I don't think they were reading the books, but the films kind of shoved in their face like this is a really successful film. By the way, one of the key scenes in the first one is this guy taking off his shirt and sparkling, and the women loving it.
I'm one of those people who was like, no, but I think I was too old for it at that point.
It wasn't. Yeah, I was too old by the time the films came out, but I did enjoy Mark Commode being like, it's just not for you, and that's okay. And he was like, the first film is actually, as a film, not really that bad, guys. It's just that you're really upset that you're seeing a load of teenage girls and women apparently really enjoying a vulnerable pretty boy taking his shirt off and sparkling, and you don't know where to put that, because normally you're used to women taking their clothes off for the male lead, and you kind of know where that goes. um and for all the major faults that there are with Twilight, and even someone like me who really, really loved those Twilight novels and wrote about them and has studied them and researched them, I will always maintain that I think it was an excellent inversion of like the female, of the male gaze into the female gaze. And I found it so interesting about what it might have said about what was increasingly attractive. And actually, yes, he was a nice, safe guy, but being a vampire made him slightly unsafe. So you got the melding of two worlds. You know, he's a doctor's son from a nice family
From a nice
who's,
family with good money.
but again, with good money and investments. And what happens? They get together, and she gets a she gets property immediately. They're like, "Hey, here's a cottage we built for you." And you're like, oh wow, because normal people have to save loads of money to be able to get down payment on their first building. But I guess once you marry into vampire money, and yeah, and like and he's rightly or wrongly wants to wait until marriage and is concerned about her and doesn't want to hurt her and blah blah blah. He's a bit overprotective and weird, but generally he's not bad guy, but he does have this little vampiric edge, which means he's not too saccharine. Because if you made him a human and he did all that, you'd be like,
Actually, my
no,
biggest
thank
issue with
you.
his being a vampire is why is he 117 years old and still going to high school? That was like you're 17, just go to university. You can learn whatever you want to learn. But again, there seems to be this because vampires are eternal. Vampires seem to be outside the system of education. They know everything. They automatically have investments. They have pallbearers and they have accountants to take care of all that for them. So they don't need to go to school. They don't need to be educated. I think as well for
Yeah,
that seems to be part of like Louis' frustration as well in Interview with the Vampire, where he wants to do things, he wants to try new things. And no, you can't. For whatever reason, he's trapped in his own head and he thinks he can't get out of that cycle and do new things. Of course you can. You're eternal. Go do what you want.
they are often very useless, but I always wonder whether it's like when I have a day off, and when I have a day off, there's all these things I want to do, and then I end up doing none of them because I'm so overwhelmed by the possibility of all the things I can do with my very few days off that are childless. And I'm like, oh my God, I could do so many things. And then my husband's like, what did you do today? And I was like, nothing, the
I sat
same
in a
things
cafe and
I
did
do.
nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, that's kind of depressing. So I wonder whether if you've got eternity, you just end up in exactly the same position where you're like paralyzed
So you're
with
saying our
indecision.
vampires really have ADHD and they suffer from analysis paralysis. That's what you're saying.
I, I mean, I suspect. I mean, why wouldn't they? I'm sure it can't. I mean, I know vampirism cures a lot of things, but it doesn't seem to be able to cure navel gazing, which is what most of these vampires do. They're all overthinkers and they're worried. And, we're all thinking about the amazing. Although, again, and I will say this, I really do enjoy the Guild stories. I only read them very recently, actually, for this talk. I was like, I really must read them. And there are a number of vampires in there where mainly what they do is just go off traveling and learning new languages and discovering new things. And I'm like, that's what I would do.
Hmm.
Like, I wouldn't be like, you know, let's just move from place to place where I can re-enroll in high school and then go to the local college and then move to the next place and do it again. I love education. I would likely get as many degrees as I possibly could, but I'd also try and speak a lot of languages and travel more. Um, that would
Absolutely.
be
That
particularly.
would be my superpower. Is like, oh, I have infinite time. Let me go learn Japanese. Let me learn all the languages in Ethiopia, all the languages in China. If you have infinite time, who cares? Doesn't matter. If somebody starts suspecting that you're a vampire, just go on to another country. They won't know you. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Right. That was always my
It,
issue with Twilight, and I just go, Why is he in high school again? This is dumb. You could do whatever you want.
I would. Okay, this is bad, but I would. I would understand doing it maybe once or twice because what happens if he had a really bad time in high school and he was really bullied previously, so he gets to do it as a do-over, but now he's super, super attractive and awesome and everyone fancies him. And I feel like I would very much like to go back to being like, so I would like to do the whole of my secondary school again, but with the knowledge of what I have now. I'm like, I do it so differently and I do it so much better. So I'll let him go back to high school once or twice to exercise those demons. But then after that, yeah, no more.
I would do it. I would maybe do it once just to get back. I wasn't really bullied, but I would do it once just to get back at people. And then but then that was it because I'd be like, I don't want to do trigonometry again for the third time. So I don't understand that whole, especially when you're a vampire. But in the Gilda stories, it's very interesting that those stories, even though Interview with the Vampire was published in the 1970s, even though we think of it as a 1990s sort of story, whereas the Gilda stories were published in the 90s, but they would very much fit in with the Interview with the Vampire, I think. And the Gilda stories are more all about it's a black woman vampire going off on a journey and really being free and having relationships and having that pure, gorgeous freedom, that being eternal and never needing to worry about money or food because you could just, grab a rat and go, all right, I've had a snack, I'm done. You never have to worry about money or food. That's another thing really that vampirism is all about is food scarcity. And if you're a rich person, as many vampires are in history, you don't have to worry about food scarcity, but poor people do. And she kind of, but Gilda has this whole journey about going off into the world and never have to worry about anything, no disease, nothing. And so she can really live her life. And I think she's really, the Gilda stories are that superlative aspect of vampirism, where if you had, and it answers the question of if you had no mobility problems, you had no issues of gender, you had no issues of money, you had no issues of education, what would you do? And she does it. But
It is.
it's interesting how those stories are buried because she doesn't have those same crushing feelings.
Yeah, she doesn't have the same amount of guilt
Nope.
that you seem to get. I mean, partly that's because she doesn't really kill many people. She kills one or two people, but they're absolutely bad guys, so you totally understand. I also really liked about it that it was just felt like very much like a restorative, like a restorative history because it's she tells a story and essentially it's just mainly people of color. So you see this version of history that you just haven't been allowed to see before. And it did exist, but it's not been one that's been presented. And it's like retelling these moments of history, but through a black lens and through one of friendship and community and relationship and how do you maintain that and cultural identity. And I found it incredibly comforting up until you get to the final bits where when you go into the future and then you're like, oh no, the future is not going to be good. It's a lot about tech and there's a lot about like destroying the planet. And again, it's written in 1991 and I think it shows 2024, if I remember correctly, but it shows a future that we've now lived through. And it's quite scarily prescient in quite an uncomfortable way. And reading that was less comfortable and less pleasant. And then you see, I think 2050, and things have kind of got even worse in terms of safety and community. But there are still these places you can escape to, and in part they only know about them because there is Bird, who is her partner, is the one who travels a lot, so they know about this safety through traveling. So that the narrative staying safe and staying put isn't always the best option. But yeah, if I was going to say anything to people, go read the Gilda stories. Like you will really enjoy them. They're brilliant, and I think they show you all the potential of what a female vampire can do. And that it's an intersectional narrative as well. So it kind of combines lots of things that have been some of the worst versions of vampirism, the ones that have been racist and xenophobic and scared and fearful about alternative sexualities, and it kind of says, okay, well, here's a version where actually it's a really positive thing, and I loved reading it.
think that's interesting because if we think about like a lot of vampires from the 70s to the 90s, a lot of it is same-sex couples. Just either having maybe not such healthy relationships, but having relationships. And it's perfectly acceptable and it's perfectly okay for them because they live outside of society. So it doesn't really matter for them. They can take whatever partner or whatever, or they could turn anybody they want to, and they do. And it's not seen as a bad thing or a thing to be feared. It's just because they don't have any fear of society, they could do what they want. And it doesn't mean
Yeah.
a vampire is a vampire to them. They don't really have this idea of gendered relationships or sexual deviance. This is how vampires do, and they're just going to do it. And that's it.
Someone did ask me a question about incest, and Lestat and his relationship with his mother. Um, and I was like, it's a really difficult one because, firstly, I did have to, everyone went, ugh, when I said this, but I was like, I don't know if you guys are aware, but like, if you look at people who work in studies in pornography, they will say that like step family porn is really, really, really popular. And that genuinely, oh, am I right upset you as well? I've known this for a while. I've just made peace with it.
Oh, I
And
know.
also I read Nancy Friday's book about like fantasies, and I was like, oh well, I feel so normal now. It's great. I was like, oh god, yeah. Um, but yeah, I was saying like I think because vampires are a way of exploring taboos, and in some ways sometimes that's to shut them down and say, oh, they're disgusting, let's stake this vampire. Increasingly, it's a way of sort of showing up societal taboos. With a character like Lestat, I suspect he's like, well, now that, yeah, like you're saying, now that I'm a vampire, what even is a taboo? What does it matter? What is a family connection? Um, I'm not saying I think I love that. It makes me feel a bit bilious myself, but I think it shows you that where do we then start questioning those limits? It's something as well that comes up in Fledgling, which I think is Fledgling by Octavia Butler is a book that I had read about it before I read it. And then when I read it, I was like, guys, I really think you sidestepped one of the really difficult things to get your head around, which is like the lead character. I know mentally she's 53, but she does have the body of a 10 or 11-year-old, and she does have sex with fully grown up adults. And that is a that is a difficult thing to get your head around. So I also like warn people, like when you start reading it, it is very, very difficult. Don't worry, you'll just do what everyone does. And I think your brain just makes her look older. That's what my brain has done. My brain's gone, no, we're going to ignore that fact. I know you made it clear. But similar to, I think, the sort of the incest taboo with Lestat, it is about this like, well, how can we use vampires to question everything? I don't necessarily think we should always question certain moral. There are some I'm like, oh, I'm okay with that. We'll just leave that there. That seems fine to me. I don't want to topple that. But I think it's a very interesting text in terms of what it's saying about constructions of power, particularly when it comes through with gender and age and sexuality. And they all sort of live in polycules in that novel, which kind of makes sense because the sexuality is very, very fluid as well. You see that a little bit with the Gilda stories as well. But yeah, I'd say Gilda stories comforting. Octavia Butler's Fledgling, really worth a read, quite challenging. Just a big old warning that it might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. And if it's not for you, that's absolutely fine. There are other taboos in vampire literature that you can see being challenged.
Yeah, there is that aspect of, when they since they have their own societies and they're not humans, they there's a whole like, oh, don't wake the sire or like or oh, how close you are to the sire depends on where your family is in the pecking order of things in certain vampire lore. And therefore, oh, don't bother the elder vampires or they have extreme power and you are the little children. Don't have sexual relations in this family. Go over there to that coterie or that polycule, and you can do that. So the way that they structure their families is different. Still creepy, but just saying.
Yeah. I mean, it comes up in the Cullen family as well because technically they're living as brother and sister. Um, and I mean, it's sidestepped by the fact that they're not really brothers and sisters, but that brings up the step sibling thing, and we're back to Pornhub. And how do we always end up back here? It's yeah, I love vampires because they can do this. I love what they tell us about the mores of society. I particularly think what they tell us about gender is really interesting and engaging. But the reality is, when it comes to the creation of narratives, there is always going to be things that appear that you find uncomfortable or unpleasant because these are fundamentally still entities with which we question notions of monstrosity. Um, and even when they seem more sympathetic, even when they seem perhaps sanitized, I think you can't help but have that slip through to a certain element because you're dealing with, and vampires just have the weight of a history of being scary and contentious and uncomfortable. And I'm not sure you're ever going to be able to get rid of that, which is why for every Gilda stories, we still have, 40 Days of Night. We still have the monstrous, horrific vampires living alongside the ones that seem to be safer, at least in some way.